The Not So Evil Viking 13 here to talk about one of my surprise hits for 2016, which was actually Mafia 3, a game that I started playing, put down, almost abandoned, and then picked back up and found myself really enjoying it, to the point where I felt like I almost had to talk to you guys about it. When Mafia 3 launched back in October, 2K Games was kind enough to send along a free review copy with no stipulations, just the code. And after jumping into the game and doing the first couple of hours, I was pretty convinced that I wouldn't be doing any kind of Mafia 3 content whatsoever. Even though I played Mafia 2 and found it to be one of my absolute favorite open world games from a few years back, especially the introduction sections of Mafia 2. The post-World War II Christmas scenes were incredibly well done, and despite Mafia 2's kind of cliffhanger weird ending, the overall game was great. Anyway, back to Mafia 3. After diving through the first couple of hours, a lot of things just felt off, mostly in the visuals department. The game felt like it had been smeared with a very greasy, plastic, just oily filter, with a lot of brown and blur going on. Nothing in the game was sharp, from the assets to the skybox, and everything had a weird glowing effect to it. All the edges of the polygons in the world were glowing. Additionally, that first launch weekend, the game was locked at 30 FPS, and while a 60 FPS patch would come pretty quickly for PC, within I think it was 2 or 3 days, it never really felt like it could handle 60 FPS, and the game tended to kind of jump around between the 40s to 60, really topping out around 57 most of the time. This was very disappointing for me, as I had been quite excited in the run-up to the launch of the game. I loved the idea of the Vietnam era as the setting for the next Mafia, and as dealing with the Mafia from the outside looking in with Lincoln Clay, and I wanted to see how that storyline was going to play out. Back in October though, I was in the middle of a massive remodeling of my home office, and it was pretty easy to set the game aside and focus on more important projects like my Fallout settlements and finishing up the Witcher DLCs. And in the meantime, I noticed that Steam kept updating Mafia 3 in the background. What was happening was, not only was the new studio behind Mafia 3, Hangar 13, adding a ton of maintenance patches to the game, they were actually adding content as well. In the weeks in between when I first tried the game on launch week and when I would actually dive in around the end of November to really give it a real attempt and try and enjoy it, they added all kinds of things from custom outfits, including combat options as well as formal outfits for Lincoln Clay, and races, and a whole bunch of car customization as well. Who's to say if that was supposed to be in the game at launch, but either way, when I hopped back in at the end of November, I found a very different looking game, a very different performing game, and a game that had a ton of new features. And if there's one thing that I am a sucker for, it's customization in single player games where I can get in there and tweak a character to my liking. With the game now running at much closer to a locked 60 FPS, even with all the graphics cranked up to Ultra and at 1440p, and with all kinds of new customization options like my suppressed 1911 pistol, I was ready to really dive into the campaign and see what the story had to offer, because everyone had been saying the story is where the game really shines. And boy, were they right.
I'll see what I can do.
Don't worry. I'll make sure you benefit as well.
Don't push me, Cassandra.
You know, at some point you're gonna have to trust me.
Maybe. We ain't there yet.
I don't know how many of you out there are going to be Tom Clancy fans, but I grew up loving the Tom Clancy fictional books about Jack Ryan and the Cold War, and one of my all-time favorites from that Tom Clancy series was a novel called Without Remorse. The storyline of Mafia 3 reminds me of Lincoln Clay's own version of the revenge story from Tom Clancy's Without Remorse, which, by the way, is a fantastic book and you should go check it out if you haven't. Like Without Remorse, The storyline of Mafia 3 lets you have just a bit of hope in the beginning, and even though you can see that bad things are coming, there's nothing you can do to stop it, and it doesn't make the betrayals that take place in the storyline hurt any less. The intro to the game also has you doing some pretty standard Mafia missions with the main characters to both introduce you to the setting, the location, but also let you get to know the characters before things really take a turn for the worst. By the time that Lincoln Clay is on his own and out looking for revenge, the revenge story actually felt a little bit personal, and this was helped by a surprisingly well done set of voice acting for the entire game, as well as some very detailed and great looking motion capture for the facial animation. This surprised me, as again, the rest of the game can look a bit dated, with some low-res assets and a lot of blurry textures, and the lighting's not always great, even after all the patches, but wow, the voice acting and the motion capture and the facial animation, that really does shine throughout the entire game.
Danny. Was he in any pain? Did he suffer?
Don't. Ain't nothing good coming from that.
Who says I need good to come from it?
Georgie shot him in the head. Looked like he went pretty quick. God damn it.
I hate
Game.
I see earthquakes and lightning. I see bad times city. Don't go around tonight. It's bound to take your life.
I was pretty impressed to see that they didn't just go for the obvious choices and back every single action scene with Fortunate Son, but you have a really wide variety of radio shows and songs to complement the setting, which is also one of the high points of the game. New Bordeaux is a fictional version of New Orleans, basically. It's 1968, and you are playing as a black man, and it's really amazing how they captured this very uncomfortable period of American history, especially here in the South. Parts of the city are really beautiful, but you can almost see the poverty lines as you cross bridges to other parts of the city, over to the bayou or River Run, some of the more rundown, low-income areas of the city where the black mafia is allowed, quote-unquote, to run things. It was really striking. I actually found myself exploring some of these poverty-stricken areas because it's very weird to go from these touristy New Orleans areas of the city and then you just cross a few blocks and it's like 100 years ago all of a sudden, with these slums with barely even having electricity and of course no air conditioning and stuff like that, and just run down rusting cars everywhere. Just a really striking contrast in the environment of the city itself. Even how the police in the city respond to your actions is very striking and also makes you a bit uncomfortable. If you're in one of those rundown slum areas of the city and you steal a car, you'll hear the dispatcher say something like, "Hey, we've got a car theft reported in River Run, check it out if you're nearby or if you have the time." But if you dare steal a car in the mostly white downtown section of the city, you'll hear the dispatcher say something about a Negro male reported stealing a car or with a gun, and instantly you've got police all over you, swarming at full speed.
I got trouble. Report of a colored male brandishing a firearm at Irish Point. Up to you if you want to check it out. On scene, officers engaging with suspect. Respond with caution. Shit's going down. Report to an armed Negro male in the French ward. Please investigate. I think that's suspect engaging with on-scene units.
Hangar 13 also spent a lot of time making you stand out as you move around the city. If you show up in a predominantly white section of the city, pedestrians will actually comment about your presence, saying, "Aren't you far away from home, boy?" and stuff like that. And while the game is chock full of some really striking racism that hits you right in the face, for me, it was the small remarks from people that really grabbed my attention and really made me feel uncomfortable. The fact that I could walk into a restaurant and the owner can say, "We don't allow your kind here," like right in front of everyone who's eating there in the restaurant. It's one of those things that, of course, we all know that that kind of thing happened. We've all learned about that history, but to be a part of it and basically on the wrong side of it was a very new and different and uncomfortable experience. And it really becomes a part of the city, the way that people react to you and to each other and the different factions. A lot of the prejudices and racism of this time period becomes a part of the city and makes it a very unique and, again, uncomfortable experience. Outside of this very well realized culture in New Bordeaux, the city itself is a lot of fun to explore. There are some collectibles, of course, just like any open world game, but a few times I found myself exploring some era-specific areas that you might not see in modern-day cities, like a giant freight yard with a train turntable, or some old-school docks out in the bayou. The time period really lets you kind of bridge the gap between a modern city and a lot of really old American Southern history that dates back to even hundreds of years ago, as parts of the game take place at an old plantation out in the swamps. Of course, I'm a sucker for history of any kind and interesting architecture anyway, so my love of exploring the city might just be because that's who I am. By the time that I reached the end of the main campaign in Mafia 3, I had spent over 47 hours in the game over a couple of months. And again, this is a game that I picked up and put down almost immediately, thinking I'd never go back to it. If I had to put a number to it, even though I don't really review games on my channel, this game would be a very solid 7 out of 10. That's up from probably a 4 out of 10 from those first few patches after launch.
Calling this one for Scaletta.
This the kind of shit that breaks the spirit of folk. You do well to keep that in mind.
Disrespect ain't attractive on you, honey. Not now, not ever.
Is this over? Because I really need to go drop a load in the bog.
We'll talk later. Get on out of here.
To wrap things up for the rest of this video, I want to go down a list of cons and pros across the course of the entire game. I'm going to keep it spoiler free, don't worry, to just share with you guys why I think the game is worth taking a second look at if you had written it off like I had. Let's just start with the cons up front. I've already mentioned some of them. Again, the graphics do feel overall pretty dated, with some very old school methods of creating assets, and while the city is really big, and I can kind of see why they wouldn't want to spend a wild amount of time doing assets for the entire thing, it feels like some of the hero locations, like the plantations or locations where there's going to be some cinematics, could have had a bit more love. And man alive, I have not seen overall texture resolutions this low and blurry since probably last gen for the consoles. It's pretty striking. Gameplay wise, if you're not careful, you can end up repeating fights at a lot of locations. You're trying to take over the city, you're working with your underbosses to do so, and being an open world game, I like to drive around and get into trouble in between story missions. But what I found is, if I went to a location, say a illegal back alley yard sale, cleared it out of Mafia enemies, and then went forward with a side mission, I might end up coming back to that same alleyway and fighting those same guys again, but this time the rewards I'm supposed to get are actually spawned in there, the money or the upgrades or the guns or whatever I'm supposed to pick up. So, I figured out very quickly to avoid the repetition, which again is one of the low points of the game and a very common complaint. Just don't do the open world thing of getting into fights as you come across them. Actually, just jump in between the side missions and follow your objective icons. Explore some on your own, but just don't get into fights in warehouses, because odds are you're going to see those same locations, those same dockyards and warehouses again if you go forward with the side missions. While I would definitely put the combat in the game on my pros category for sure, there's a way you can kind of mess that up too. If you stick to just your favorite guns in Mafia 3 and you don't mix it up whatsoever, you are probably going to get bored by the end, because the gunplay generally plays out the same throughout the entire game. But I loved how little ammo I could carry, especially for the first 2/3 of the game before I got some of the later upgrades, because it meant that I was swapping weapons pretty frequently, and there really wasn't a weapon that I picked up that I did not have fun with. There's a wide variety of very fun Vietnam era weapons, from the classic M14, which is one of my all-time favorite rifles, to the Mafia Tommy gun, and thanks to some free patches you can add things like drum magazines onto the Tommy gun. You can get a standard or suppressed 1911 with some gold kind of scroll work on it. Although, again, come on, Hangar 13, you guys screwed up. The hammer is down on the 1911. It's a single action pistol. It can't fire with the hammer down. Don't worry though, you're in good company. A lot of studios make that mistake. It just drives me crazy. Looking at you too, DICE, and your bad company to 1911 with the hammer down. But yeah, the shotguns actually feel like shotguns, and as long as you do try just about every weapon in the game and don't just stick to your favorites for too much of the game, you're gonna have a lot of fun with the combat. Don't let it get old though. Make sure you mix things up. Well, that's enough talking about the cons. Let's talk about the pros and why I would give this game a pretty solid 7 out of 10. First of all, the gunplay is a lot of fun if you do what I just mentioned and mix things up. Also, I put the difficulty on hard, so a couple of good shotgun hits, if you are caught out in the open, are going to put you down. But also, enemies aren't bullet sponges, and firefights tend to be extremely tense. Battles of moving cover and grenades and flanking and picking up weapons. The combination of changing guns pretty frequently, along with that hard difficulty, made firefights brutal. I mean, they were intense. I don't know if I'd call it heart pounding, but it's very, very intense and incredibly enjoyable. The ragdolls and getting headshots is especially satisfying.
Shit! Grenade! Yeah, you see him?
Now when it comes to the driving in Mafia 3, you've got a couple of options, just a standard mode, or you can turn on advanced driving physics. I don't really know what that means, but I turned on the advanced driving very early on and really had fun with it. I don't know if it's the advanced setting or just the period cars, but the driving is slidey and fun. Far better than what Watch Dogs 1 has, and having just tried Watch Dogs 2 recently, I think I actually enjoy the slidiness of Mafia 3 more. Although, of course, you know, in Watch Dogs 2, you've got much more modern cars with better tires and all that sort of thing, better brakes, so they're going to handle better, for sure. And what's some good driving without some good cars? And let me tell you, there are some fantastic classic cars here in Mafia 3. Now, I'm not a car guy. I couldn't tell you probably what any of them are supposed to be. But I can enjoy classic cars, as I've discovered. And I also enjoyed trying out a good number of these different cars that you can get delivered to you as you progress over the campaign.
Move.
No, not my car.
The ring of fire, and it burns, burns, burns. The ring of fire, the ring of fire.
As I mentioned earlier, that ability to customize your car, as well as your clothes and your guns and your upgrades, for me was just the right amount of unlocking and customization to keep things moving throughout the entire, 47 hours of the campaign. I always get frustrated when you load a game up like, okay, I'm going to call out Watch Dogs 2 again here, and there's not only 1,000 different options, which is fine, but there's also, instantly screens pushing, oh, buy this premium pack, buy this theme pack, and all that stuff. Mafia 3 had none of that. You just hopped in and you rolled with it. There were just enough options to customize your guns, clothes, and cars that it really just felt about perfect. Combine all of the above with the detailed world that I mentioned back at the beginning of the video, the very well-paced and well-done soundtrack with lots of variety that kicks in at just the perfect moments during story missions, as well as the great voice acting, good writing too. Gotta give a shout out to the writers and the animators for the facial features. Combine all that together, and I found the main campaign to be very, very compelling, and to use my famous I word, very, very immersive as well. I really cared about Lincoln Clay's story, and about what happened to the people around him, and the presentation of the campaign being flash forwards combined with your gameplay basically being the flashbacks, left a lot of things up in the air, where they would have a flash forward to congressional hearings about what happened there in New Bordeaux back in 1968, and would give hints of what was about to happen in your gameplay, and then the music would kick in, and it would be up to you to actually fulfill that. And again, as a big-time Clancy fan, to see a neat twist with Lincoln Clay being essentially a main character in my own version of Without Remorse was really, really neat. I took a lot of pleasure in this Lincoln Clay revenge story. It was very satisfying. And to my surprise, at the end, you've got a couple of big decisions to make. I don't want to spoil anything, but some of the consequences kind of caught me by surprise. And there's some neat conspiracy twist at the end of the main story that also caught me by surprise and opened things up for the next game, quite possibly. I hope so, at least. For a game that I was quite sure that I would never be going back to, I am very glad that I went back to Mafia 3, and I have to say that I greatly enjoyed the 47 hours that I spent there. The set pieces, the city, the story, the voice acting, the characters, everything came together and overcame the negatives, and I had a really fantastic time. Now, I'm not sure if I'm going to dip my toes into the DLC. It sounds somewhat interesting, but some of it sounds like it's going to be more linear. But hey, if the main story holds up with the quality of the base game's main story, then even a more linear DLC could be pretty fantastic. So, if you guys are looking for some open world games to scratch that itch this year, keep an eye out for a sale on Mafia 3, and perhaps give it a second chance like I did. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you've enjoyed. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the game if you've already tried it, and I'll see you guys next time.
I'll be seeing you, Padre.